Hey, everybody, and welcome back to Sip and Talk. Picture this, right? I saw this thing online the other day that totally made me stop and go, whoa.
Oh, yeah. What was it?
This woman in the U.S. who was Chinese commented on a video from someone in Taiwan. The video was about wanting freedom. Seems like a positive message, you know?
Uh-huh.
And the Chinese woman replied, calling them a Taiwanese compatriot, like, you know, maybe trying for a friendly, we're all in this together kind of vibe.
Right. You could definitely see how someone might think that would be like a unifying term.
Exactly. But the Taiwanese person's response was, well, let's just say it wasn't exactly warm and fuzzy. They basically said something like, nah, we're good on the Marx thing, but thanks and good luck with your own future. It was a really sharp reaction to what maybe seemed like an olive branch.
Yeah, that really highlights how just one seemingly simple word can carry so much weight, so much like historical baggage.
Right. And that little online moment, it got me thinking about some of the articles you all sent in. Like, Why is it that so many Taiwanese people get this kind of almost instant recoil to terms like compatriot or one family across the strait? Even blood is thicker than water.
Mm-hmm.
It's like what sounds like a warm, fuzzy connection to some folks just lands completely differently with others. So I guess a key takeaway for us, for you listening right off the bat, is that this term compatriot sounds friendly, but it's actually loaded.
Yeah.
Loaded with political meaning, a history of intended unification.
Which many Taiwanese actively reject, absolutely.
Yeah.
And today, that's exactly what we're diving into. Our goal really is to unpack the reasons behind this feeling.
Right.
We're going to look at the history, the politics, the cultural differences, and even, you know, how different generations see things differently.
And we've got some great source material here that really analyzes this whole compatriot thing and explores why some people in Taiwan see China not just as like different, but maybe even as a real adversary.
Yeah, it goes deep.
And just to be super clear up front, we're not here to pick sides in any of this. It's really all about understanding the different viewpoints that these sources are laying out for us.
Exactly. Impartial exploration. So let's start with this word itself, compatriot. It's not just a neutral label, is it?
Doesn't sound like it.
No. A lot of people in Taiwan really see it as tainted, kind of outdated, almost like something from a bygone era that just doesn't fit anymore.
And what's interesting when you dig into it is where the word even comes from. In Chinese, it's tongbo, right? Which literally means born of the same mother, basically. So you can see how it kind of expands to mean people of the same country.
But, and this is key, if you look at how China's online encyclopedia Baidu Baike defines it, it's actually evolved. It now defines it as people of the same nation.
Oh, okay. Nation. That's different.
It's a really significant shift in meaning. It's not just about sharing a piece of land or a passport. It's pushing this idea of a shared national identity.
Which is precisely what many Taiwanese don't feel or actively reject.
Exactly. So it feels imposed. The English words we might use, like fellow countrymen or even compatriot, they tend to focus more on shared nationality, you know, the legal status. Not this deeper, more politically charged idea of shared ethnicity or inherent nationhood that the Chinese term, as used by the PRC, implies.
Yeah, that makes sense.
The sources we have point out that just like the terms Chinese, whether you say Dihuan or Zhongguo, compatriot has become so wrapped up in politics that its original meaning is almost lost. It's heavily politicized.
It's like trying to fit a square peg in a round hole then. The language just doesn't quite match the reality of how many Taiwanese people see themselves or their relationship with China.
Precisely. One of our sources even suggests that maybe focusing on shared values, things like democracy, freedom, might be a much more relevant way to connect.
Instead of relying on this potentially divisive compatriot label.
Exactly. Shared principles can often forge a much stronger bond than just, you know, a label about national identity, especially when that label is contested. There's even this analogy mentioned in one piece. Brothers climbing mountains, each striving for their own goals.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah, it paints this picture of a relationship where there can be shared aspirations, maybe even mutual support, but without needing that specific compatriot label to define it, it allows for difference.
It kind of reminds me, actually, of when I was living over in Australia, I'd interact with the Hong Kong community there, especially during some of the really politically charged times.
Sure.
And even with the best intentions, you could really, like, step on someone's toes by using certain terms or making assumptions about a shared identity, experiences, and sensitivities.
That's a really insightful connection. It really highlights how important it is to be aware of the sort of emotional and historical landscape that shapes how people interpret language. Words aren't just words.
Absolutely not. And speaking of history, that huge split back in 1949 between mainland China and Taiwan, I mean, that still casts a massive shadow, doesn't it?
Oh, undeniably. All that long-standing tension, the decades of separation, it definitely creates a real emotional distance for many. And the PRC's constant claim that Taiwan is part of its territory is, of course, a core issue. For many Taiwanese, this isn't just some abstract political point. It feels like continuous pressure, like a threat to their ability to decide their own future.
And you can't forget how China constantly tries to limit Taiwan's involvement on the world stage.
Right.
Getting squeezed out of international organizations like the WHO, for example, that has to make people feel like they're being unfairly treated. Like China is acting as this, was some of our sources put it, an oppressor.
Exactly. Those actions really fuel that sense of a separate identity and, understandably, create resentment towards the entity that's seen as blocking their rightful place in the international community.
Okay, so let's maybe switch gears a little bit and talk more about identity and culture specifically. Our sources really emphasize this strong feeling of Taiwanese-ness that has developed over time.
Yeah, it's palpable.
It's not just about having a different passport. A lot of people will explicitly say, I am Taiwanese, not Chinese.
Yeah.
And the numbers, well, they really back this up, don't they?
They really do. There's Pew Research Center data from just this year, 2024. It shows that a huge majority, 67% of Taiwanese people, primarily identify as Taiwanese.
67%. Wow.
Yeah, and only a tiny 3% primarily identify as Chinese. Then you've got about 28% who see themselves as both Taiwanese and Chinese.
Okay.
And this trend is even stronger with younger people.
Yeah.
Get this. 83% of those under 35 identify solely as Taiwanese.
83. That's a massive difference between the
It
generation.
really is. And it's not just a recent blip. If you look at polls from National Chengchi University over the long term, you see this consistent rise. People identifying only as Taiwanese went from about, 17, 18% back in 1992 to over 54% recently. And at the same time, those identifying solely as Chinese dropped from 25% down to under 4%.
That's incredible. It really shows how much this distinct Taiwanese identity has solidified, especially for those who've grown up in a democratic Taiwan.
Exactly. For them, being separate, having their own identity, it just feels natural. It's the world they know. Older generations who might have different historical connections or memories might still feel a Chinese identity, but that's clearly fading as the dominant perspective.
It's like two plants that maybe started as the same seed but have grown up in totally different gardens, different soil, different weather.
That's a great analogy.
They might look a little similar in some ways, but they've developed their own unique flowers and roots. And it's not just the big political stuff either, like little cultural differences in everyday life.
Oh, yeah. Like what?
Things like how people queue up or maybe noise levels in public spaces, stuff like that. Apparently, those small things can add to this feeling of being distinct, of having different norms.
Absolutely. These seemingly small differences in social behavior, they can contribute to a sense of us and them. It's the accumulation of these everyday experiences that subtly reinforces a feeling of separate identities.
And then you throw social media into the mix, which can be a bit of a minefield.
Understatement. It sounds like negative portrayals of tourists from the mainland, maybe stereotypes, and definitely those super nationalistic little pink comments online. They really stir up negative feelings.
Yeah, the little pinks. For anyone listening who doesn't know, that's a term for these very vocal, often pretty aggressive Chinese nationalists you see online.
Exactly. And these online interactions, even if they come from a smaller, maybe very vocal group, they can have a really big impact on how people perceive each other. They can reinforce negative stereotypes pretty quickly.
Right. When you constantly see negativity or like aggressive nationalism directed your way online, it's easy for those impressions to stick and maybe overshadow other experiences.
Definitely. So it's not just these abstract political ideas we're talking about. It's these very real, sometimes very personal interactions online and offline that contribute to this feeling of distance.
And all of this, I'm guessing, it feeds into that underlying fear, the fear of unification.
Absolutely. That worry about potential forced unification by China is a very real and significant factor for many, many Taiwanese. The idea of losing their democratic freedoms, their way of life as they know it, it's deeply concerning.
And it's almost like a natural defense mechanism kicks in then, right? This kind of, I don't want to be part of you, and I definitely don't want you to be part of me feeling. as a way to, like, protect themselves from that potential threat.
Exactly. It's about drawing clear lines, asserting a distinct identity when you feel like there's this constant external pressure trying to erase those lines.
Yeah.
And, while some people might carefully say, hey, look, I don't have anything against Chinese people. It's the Chinese government I have issues with.
Right. You hear that distinction sometimes.
You do. But the sources suggest that in reality, especially when tensions are high, those feelings can often get tangled up. It becomes harder to separate the two in people's minds.
That makes sense. It gets messy. Now let's talk specifically about that phrase, go home. Why can that be so incredibly offensive? To someone who doesn't understand the context, it might just sound like, someone telling you to go back where you came from. Rude, maybe, but
in this specific context between China and Taiwan, it's anything but innocent. Go home basically implies that Taiwan belongs to China.
Okay.
And that Taiwanese people are somehow just away from their rightful place. It completely dismisses the distinct Taiwanese identity that has grown and evolved, especially since Taiwan became a democracy in the 1990s.
Gotcha. So the core insight here is that this phrase isn't just about physical location. It's a direct challenge to Taiwanese identity, to their history, to their sovereignty.
Precisely. So for many Taiwanese, being told to return isn't seen as some kind of warm homecoming celebration. It's viewed as a direct threat to their democratic way of life, a fundamental denial of their right to decide their own future.
And the data seems to support that feeling of threat.
It does. Data from the Brookings Institution back in 2022 showed that a large majority, 63% of Taiwanese, have a negative view of the Chinese government. And 66% see its influence on Taiwan negatively.
Wow. Only 8% positive.
Only 8% had a positive view. So given those overwhelming feelings, being told to go home to a place governed by a system they view so negatively and which they see as a potential threat, yeah, it's understandably deeply offensive.
Makes total sense.
And it's also interesting to note political affiliation plays a role here, too. Supporters of the DPP, the party that generally leans towards Taiwanese independence, they have much lower emotional attachment to China compared to supporters of the KMT, who tend to favor closer relations historically.
So it shows there isn't one single view. But the dominant trend, especially recently, is definitely towards that strong, separate Taiwanese identity.
That's right.
Okay, so we're getting a really clear picture now of why compatriot and go home are such loaded, sensitive terms. But let's dive into the maybe the more extreme end of the spectrum that some sources mention, why some Taiwanese people see China not just as different or as a source of pressure, but as an actual enemy. That feels like a pretty significant escalation.
It is. It's a much stronger stance. And the sources we looked at highlight several key reasons for this view. The main one, unsurprisingly, is the PRC's authoritarian system combined with its very real, tangible, hostile actions towards Taiwan.
Like the military stuff.
Exactly. The constant military threats, the warplanes flying near Taiwan, the refusal to renounce the use of force. These aren't just abstract political ideas. We saw that Reuters report from just last October, 2024, about 25 Chinese warplanes entering Taiwan's Air Defense Identification Zone, the ADIZ.
25 in one go.
Yeah, and there were apparently over 1,700 of these kinds of incursions in 2023 alone. That kind of constant military pressure feels like a direct, immediate threat to your existence.
Yeah, it's hard to feel any kind of kinship with someone who's constantly buzzing your house with military jets. It definitely shifts the dynamic from distant cousin to something much more menacing.
Absolutely. Then you add China's ongoing efforts to isolate Taiwan internationally, trying to block their participation in the World Health Organization, for instance, even during a pandemic. These actions are perceived by many as direct acts of hostility, plain and simple.
Okay, so the government's actions are a huge factor.
Yeah.
What else contributes to this enemy perception for some?
Well, there's this feeling, which seems more prevalent among those with the strongest negative views, that the Chinese people and the Chinese Communist Party, the CCP, are almost inseparable.
That's a difficult one.
It is. The argument goes that many Chinese citizens either actively support the CCP's policies towards Taiwan or at least don't do much to oppose them, leading to this feeling of a single, unified other that is hostile.
That's really tough to unpack, isn't it? I mean, you can see how those feelings might arise, especially when you see really nationalistic stuff online, or you read reports about people supporting aggressive actions against Taiwan.
Right. The sources mention that backlash against the actress Zhao Wei a few years ago, just over some perceived pro-Taiwan independence views she might have had.
I remember that.
And those reports in the South China Morning Post where some Chinese citizens were actually quoted supporting the idea of using force against Taiwan. Those kinds of things definitely don't help build bridges.
No kidding.
And when you look at reports, like from Freedom House, about how restricted free speech is in China, it makes it seem even harder for dissenting voices that might not support the government line, to even be heard internationally or maybe even domestically.
So it creates a situation where, for some observers in Taiwan, it becomes hard to separate the actions of the government from the perceived sentiments of the broader population, even if that's maybe a simplification.
Exactly. Then, of course, you have the whole weight of history and the ongoing tensions.
Wow.
The legacy of the Chinese Civil War is still there, implicitly or explicitly, and the current situation often feels like just a continuation of that historical divide.
Right.
And we can't forget the White Terror period in Taiwan's own history, a time of intense political oppression under the KMT, often justified by fighting communism. That also left a lasting negative mark on how some people view communist China.
And more recently, Hong Kong looms large, doesn't it?
Hugely. The crackdown there, especially after the 2019 protests, has been a massive wake-up call for many in Taiwan. Polls showed a big jump in negative views of China right after those events.
It makes that whole one country, two systems promise look, well, pretty shaky.
To say the least. For many Taiwanese, Hong Kong serves as a cautionary tale, making the idea of unification under a similar model feel incredibly dangerous, a direct threat to their freedoms.
Okay, so military threats, the CCP perception, history, Hong Kong. What else?
Well, in our interconnected world, we also have to consider media and information, or disinformation. China's efforts to build soft power sometimes backfire. What are alleged to be disinformation campaigns, especially during sensitive times.
Like the pandemic.
Exactly. There were reports of alleged misinformation being spread during COVID-19. And also the constant pressure on international companies, airlines, hotels, fashion brands to label Taiwan as Taiwan, China.
Right, I've seen that happen.
These kinds of actions can be seen as manipulative, as coercive attempts to impose China's political view, and they can further erode trust and harden negative feelings.
It feels like this constant, not-so-subtle pressure campaign on multiple fronts, and I guess for the younger generation who've only ever known a democratic Taiwan, this kind of pressure and these threats probably feel even more alienating, right?
Absolutely. We touched on this with identity, but it's crucial here too. Younger generations in Taiwan, having grown up in a fully democratic system, are often much more sensitive to these actions by the PRC. They're much more likely to see China as a distinct and potentially hostile entity.
Yeah. The strong support for President Tsai Ing-wen, whose party leans towards sovereignty in the 2020 election, especially among young voters, really highlights this generational perspective.
And there was that specific anecdote mentioned.
Yeah, one source mentioned interviewing a 23-year-old in Taiwan, Mei Xiaoen, who explicitly said she views China as an enemy. And her reasons. Directly cited the military threats and what she saw happen in Hong Kong. That's her lived experience shaping her perspective very directly.
Wow. And we've got some really concrete examples of recent events that fuel this negative sentiment too, right? Beyond just the general trends.
Yes, the sources point to specific things. Those repeated PLA incursions into the ADIZ we mentioned, the implementation of the Hong Kong national security law, and the strong reactions it provoked in Taiwan. Even things like those really nasty, hostile comments from some Chinese netizens directed towards Taiwanese athletes during international competitions.
Oh, right. That can get really ugly online. It can. And also the pressure that's sometimes put on Taiwanese artists or celebrities to publicly express pro-unification views or distance themselves from anything seen as pro-Taiwanese identity.
That must feel incredibly stifling and coercive.
Exactly. These aren't just abstract political arguments. They're real-world events and pressures that have a direct negative impact on how people in Taiwan feel and why some come to view China, not just with suspicion, but as an adversary.
Okay, so, wow. To wrap up this part of our deep dive anyway, it seems pretty clear now why that simple call of compatriot from across the Taiwan Strait can land with such a thud for so many people in Taiwan.
Yeah.
And why the suggestion to go home feels less like a friendly invitation and much more like a veiled threat, really.
Definitely. It's this whole complex mix of historical baggage, current political realities, a deeply felt separate identity, and very real fears based on China's actions and rhetoric.
And when you look at why some people in Taiwan take that further step to viewing China as an actual enemy, it seems rooted in very understandable concerns. The military aggression, the perception that the Chinese public is largely aligned with the CCP's goals for Taiwan, and especially the erosion of freedoms we've seen in places like Hong Kong.
It's a viewpoint that comes from a sense of immediate threat and fundamentally a strong desire to protect their own hard-won democracy and way of life.
It's a lot to think about, but hey, we're not done yet. You gotta stick around because when we come back, we're gonna be digging into another really important piece of this whole puzzle.
What's that?
The idea of China's bait-and-switch tactics, you might hear it, called Yu Ingtaosha, and what that means when we're talking about the relationship between China and Taiwan, particularly in business and influence. Trust me, you're going to want to hear this next part.
Yeah, that adds another critical dimension to understanding the complexities and the mistrust that exists. It's really important context.
For sure. And hey, before we take a quick pause, I got to give a shout out to our buddy Micky and his YouTube channel, Mickytolife. Seriously, you guys should check it out if you haven't.
Micky stuff is fun.
It is. He's got some really fun and interesting stuff based on his own experiences, just living life. You know, Micky was telling me the other day about this time he tried to... Oh, wait, maybe I'll save that hilarious story for another time.
Yeah.
Might get us off track.
Probably wise.
Yeah. But seriously, go give his channel some love. Mickytolife, he's a friend of the show, puts out some great content, worth a look.
Definitely. It's always great to hear different perspectives and, personal stories too.
All right. So for you listening out there, as you're letting all this sink in, maybe chew on this for a bit. How do these really different historical stories, these different narratives and these really different sets of values, how do they shape how people see their national identity and how they view each other across borders or across straits?
And maybe think about, is there any way forward for the relationship between China and Taiwan that can actually acknowledge these really deep differences and fears rather than trying to paper over them?
Yeah. It's a huge question. No easy answers there.
Not at all. But understanding these different perspectives, like we've tried to explore today based on the sources, that's got to be the first step in navigating this incredibly complex relationship.
Absolutely.
All right, everyone, welcome back. So this is part 2 of our deep dive.
Yeah. What have we got?
We're looking at China's tech strategies, this really interesting concept called, how do you say it? Yang Taosha.
Yeah. Osh. Roughly translates to cultivate, ensnare, slaughter. Sounds pretty dramatic.
It does. And we're also diving into what's happening with Apple's massive supply chain shifts. You're after the quick but deep info. And honestly, there are some seriously eyebrow-raising bits in here.
Absolutely. And what's really fascinating is how these pieces, China's tech playbook, Tesla's journey there, Apple pulling back production, they sort of weave together. They tell a bigger story about the global economy right now.
Right. So our mission basically is to pull out the key insights for you, connect those dots without, getting totally lost in the weeds.
Exactly. Let's do it.
Okay, so let's tackle this Yang Taosha thing first. Cultivate, ensnare, slaughter. It sounds less like business and more like, well, something else.
Huh? Yeah, but it describes a specific strategic approach we see. First, cultivate. China might welcome foreign tech companies, maybe even offer support, let them build up the market.
Okay, like letting them plant the seeds.
Pretty much. Then comes ensnare. This is where China learns from these foreign players.
Yeah.
They foster local competitors, maybe encourage technology transfer, build up their own capabilities. The foreign companies become more embedded, maybe more dependent on the Chinese market or supply chain.
Gotcha. They're kind of stuck in the web at that point.
You could say that.
Yeah.
And finally, slaughter. This doesn't always mean literally kicking them out, but using the now strong local industry, maybe policy shifts, market dynamics, to squeeze the foreign players, reduce their dominance, and favor the homegrown champions.
Wow. Okay, that's quite a strategy. Why is this approach apparently so common there? What are the sources suggesting?
Well, a big driver seems to be this push for technological autonomy. You hear about policies like Made in China 2025, aiming for self-sufficiency in key tech areas.
Right, boosting their own industries.
Yeah, exactly. And there's this interesting interpretation of, independent R&D. It seems it can sometimes mean taking existing tech, maybe open source stuff, adapting it, optimizing it locally, and then calling that independent development. It's not always invention from zero.
Okay, so like building on existing foundations rather than starting from scratch every time.
Precisely.
Huh.
Which brings us to robotics. This is a great case study.
Yeah, you found some interesting stuff here, like official Chinese media hyping up their world-leading robots.
Yeah, big pronouncements, Very advanced stuff, supposedly.
But then reality bites. You mentioned that H1 robot having, let's say, performance issues at multiple big expos.
Performance issues, putting it mildly. Repeatedly malfunctioning at major events like in Guiyang, Shanghai, Hunan.
Yeah.
It just didn't work as advertised. It's just, kind of awkward when you're claiming global leadership.
Definitely awkward. It creates this weird disconnect, right, between the hype and what's actually happening on the ground.
It really does. And it feeds into that question about kick.
Yeah.
Take the Walker X robot by UBTech. Presented as a big leap, right?
Uh-huh.
But the sources suggest it heavily relied on a U.S. firm, Spec Design, for really core stuff, the industrial design, the mechanical engineering, even basic movement.
Wow. Okay. So not quite independent then.
Well, UBTech presented itself as a leader without really highlighting that collaboration. And you see similar questions pop up elsewhere. Yushu Technologies' robot dog, the A1,
Yeah.
looks suspiciously similar to Boston Dynamics' Spot. They claimed it was the first electric drive quadruped, but that ignored earlier open source projects like Mini Cheetah.
Okay. Convenient omission.
And then shortly after other open source robot dogs appeared, suddenly Huawei and Tencent had very similar looking ones too. It's a pattern.
So what's the motivation behind pushing this jet narrative so hard, even when the reality is more complex?
Well, several things probably. Building national brands, tapping into patriotism, buy local.
Sure, that makes sense.
Attracting investment is huge too. You mentioned the figure, over 20 billion RMB poured into China's robotics sector in just 2023. Big claims attract big money.
Right. And maybe government subsidies play a role too, if you're seen as a national tech leader.
Very likely. It all fits the broader strategic goals.
Yeah.
And look, this isn't just robotics. Think about Android.
Oh, yeah, good example. Chinese phone makers all used Google's Android initially.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Then they built their own skins on top, like Xiaomi's MIUI or Oppo's Color OS. Still Android underneath, but with their own look and feel.
And then Google services got blocked.
Right. And that forced them to build out their own complete ecosystems, app stores, services, the whole 9 yards. Even Huawei's Harmony OS, which they market hard as a totally separate thing.
Yeah.
Initially, it relied heavily on Android's open source core, AOSP. It's that same pattern. Leverage the existing base, then build your own walled garden on top.
Thanks for the starter kit. We'll take it from here.
Exactly. And AI looks similar too, right?
Totally. Chinese researchers digging into OpenAI's papers, using open source models like GPT-2, GPT-3, LoRa.
Studying the blueprints.
And then boom, you get domestic large language models like Baidu's ErnieBot or ChatGLM, often built using that open source tech. ErnieBot even admitted using Stable Diffusion for images.
Right. And you can easily foresee a future where foreign AI tools face more restrictions in China, pushing users towards these domestic alternatives. It's the playbook again.
Cultivate, ensnare, potentially slaughter down the line, even developer platforms like GitHub.
Yeah, lots of Chinese developers rely on GitHub. It's the global standard.
But now there's Gitty.
Exactly, Gitty or Evian. A domestic platform heavily inspired by GitHub's functions. And there are whispers that certain sensitive sectors like military or high-tech R&D might be encouraged or even required to shift to domestic platforms like Gitty eventually.
Wow. Okay, so it's a pervasive strategy across different tech domains, which brings us to the big question you flagged. Has Tesla been Yang Tao Shayed?
Tesla. It's a fascinating case. Let's look at the timeline.
Okay, they got the green light in 2018, right? First, wholly foreign-owned car factory allowed. Big deal.
Huge deal. Then the Shanghai Gigafactory went up in, record time in 2019.
Crazy fast. And from 2020, Model 3s and Model Ys started rolling out, selling really well. Shanghai became a massive global production hub for them. Looked like a huge success story.
On the surface, yes. Now let's apply the framework. Cultivate.
Definitely seems to fit. China rolled out the red carpet, right? Full ownership, land deals, tax breaks, access to that huge market. Plus, they pushed Tesla to use local suppliers.
Crucially, they supported localizing the supply chain. Companies like CATL and Desai Battery became key partners. This wasn't just good for Tesla, it massively stimulated the entire Chinese electric vehicle or NEV industry. Tesla was the catalyst.
Okay, so Tesla helped cultivate the field, then ensnare.
Well, what happened next? A flood of local competitors emerged. BYD, XPeng, NIO, Li Auto, even Huawei getting involved with its smart car systems.
Yeah, suddenly the market was crowded.
And Tesla's supply chain became very local, over 90% by 2023, sources say. Talent started moving from Tesla to these new local startups. And you felt a shift maybe in government enthusiasm, more focus on promoting the homegrown players.
So Tesla built the ecosystem, and now the local companies are thriving in it. Seems like ensnarement.
It fits the pattern. Tesla became deeply integrated, maybe even dependent on that China operation and supply chain, which leads to slaughter.
Now, this is the tricky part. They weren't banned or anything, right?
No, not an outright ban. It's more subtle. What do we see? Gradual phasing out of NEV subsidies, which eroded Tesla's price advantage.
Okay.
A cooling of Tesla's brand image, perhaps?
Yeah.
Chinese consumers started shifting towards brands like BYD, which felt more like national champions.
Yeah, you hear about that?
And then the data restrictions starting in 2023, limiting Tesla's ability to collect data for its self-driving systems. That directly impacts their ability to update and improve full self-driving FSD in China.
That's a big hit to their tech advantage there.
Definitely. And the final piece, BYD actually surpassed Tesla in sales within China. That forced Tesla into price cuts to stay competitive.
So putting it all together, Tesla wasn't maybe slaughtered in the harshest sense, but they've been significantly squeezed. The environment changed around them.
I think that's a fair assessment. They weren't eliminated, but the cultivate phase clearly benefited local players immensely. The ensnare phase saw those competitors rise and Tesla become deeply integrated. And the slaughter phase involves market pressure, policy shifts, and data restrictions that favored the domestic industry. It's like a soft Yang Tao Sha, maybe, using market forces more than explicit bans.
A soft slaughter. Still sounds pretty rough. Okay, so that's Tesla. Now let's pivot to Apple. You looked into whether they're genuinely making a big supply chain shift away from China. What's the picture there?
Yeah, the data points towards a pretty significant diversification effort. It's not talk. Things are happening.
Okay, where are they going mainly? India seems to be a huge focus.
Absolutely. The numbers are quite stark. By March 2025, iPhones assembled in India could be worth around $22 billion.
Wow, $22 billion.
Yeah, that's apparently like a 60% increase year over year and would represent maybe 20% of global iPhone shipments.
20%. That's massive.
It is. And the ambition is reportedly to have most iPhones for the U.S. market actually assembled in India by the end of 2026. They're not just doing the basic models either. India can now assemble the whole range, including the Pro models.
So the capability is there now, and that Make in India policy push probably helps.
It definitely provides incentives. And then there's Vietnam.
Right. What's happening there?
Vietnam's become a major hub for things like AirPods, the Apple Watch, and even some MacBook production is shifting there. Suppliers like Foxconn are investing heavily, signing long leases for factories.
Okay, so India for iPhones, Vietnam for accessories and some computers. Are they looking elsewhere too?
They seem to be exploring options. Malaysia, Indonesia, even Mexico get mentioned. But really, India and Vietnam are the two primary pillars of this diversification strategy right now.
And we have numbers on the investment. It sounds expensive.
Oh, for sure. One report mentioned Apple and its suppliers investing something like $16 billion since 2018, specifically on shifting or reshoring manufacturing away from China.
16 billion? Okay, they're serious. And you said India's share of iPhone production jumped?
Yeah, from around 7% in 2023 to about 14% in 2024. Doubled in a year. And Vietnam's capacity, particularly for Macs and iPads, could potentially handle something like 40% of U.S. demand.
So step by step, they are moving significant chunks. What's pushing them? Why make such a huge, costly shift?
It's a mix of factors, really. Geopolitics is a big one. The U.S.-China trade tensions that kicked off back in 2018 haven't gone away. There's always the risk of higher tariffs on goods coming from China.
Yeah, that uncertainty must be tough for planning.
Exactly. And China itself has imposed some export controls on key materials and tech, which adds another layer of risk for companies relying on Chinese suppliers.
Okay, trade wars and export controls. What else?
The pandemic was a huge wake-up call. Remember China's zero-COVID policy in 2022?
Oh, yeah, the massive lockdowns in Shanghai, Zhengzhou.
Right. Those caused major factory shutdowns. And the labor disruptions at the huge Foxconn plant in Zhengzhou, the main iPhone assembly site, really hammered home the danger of having all your eggs in one basket, region-wise.
Makes sense. Don't want your whole production line shut down by one localized issue.
Precisely. Then you've got costs. Labor costs in China have been rising steadily for years.
Right.
While places like India and Vietnam offer lower labor costs, plus, as you mentioned, government incentives to attract manufacturing investment. Their own manufacturing ecosystems are also getting better, more sophisticated.
In competition within China, does that play a role?
I think so. Local brands like Huawei making a comeback in smartphones increase the competitive pressure on Apple within the Chinese market itself.
Okay. And is there also maybe subtle pressure from Chinese policy? You mentioned that before.
Yeah, it's part of the landscape. While China publicly courts foreign investment, there's often an underlying expectation or encouragement for foreign firms to help develop local industries. Remember that reported secret deal from 2016 where Apple supposedly committed billions to help China's tech sector?
Vaguely, yeah.
And things like restricting government employees from using iPhones, even if officially denied, sometimes send signals about the shifting priorities.
Okay, so lots of reasons pushing Apple to diversify, but it can't be easy, right? Moving a supply chain that complex, what are the big challenges?
Oh, huge challenges.
Yeah.
China still has massive advantages. Its manufacturing ecosystem, the network of suppliers, the logistics, the infrastructure is unparalleled. It's incredibly efficient.
And the skilled labor.
Exactly. A massive pool of skilled workers. Tim Cook himself has said how difficult it is to replicate the sheer scale and the precision manufacturing skills found in China. I mean, Apple actually increased its number of Chinese suppliers in 2023, even while diversifying.
That's interesting. So they're diversifying, but still deeply reliant.
Very much so. And the time and cost involved in moving are just enormous. One estimate suggests that it could take maybe 8 years to move just 10% of Apple's production capacity out of China.
8 years for 10%. Wow.
Yeah. Building up a comparable ecosystem in India or Vietnam will take many, many years. It's not an overnight switch.
And there are risks in the new locations too, right? Geopolitics doesn't just disappear.
Absolutely. You've got ongoing tensions between China and India, for example. Could China potentially hinder the transfer by restricting exports of key components or materials needed in India or Vietnam? Maybe.
A possibility.
And there's no guarantee the U.S. won't eventually slap tariffs on goods from India or Vietnam down the line either. Shifting production to the U.S. itself is largely seen as unrealistic due to costs and lack of a comparable electronics manufacturing base. So it's complex.
It really is. And this connects back maybe to that idea you mentioned earlier, saying one thing, doing another.
Potentially. You see China saying it welcomes foreign investment, but then maybe imposing export controls that complicate diversification plans for companies like Apple.
Right.
And Apple publicly talks up diversification, which they are doing. But the reality remains they are still incredibly dependent on China for a huge chunk of their manufacturing and, frankly, sales too. These kinds of gaps between public statements and operational realities are just part of the complex environment these multinational companies navigate.
Okay, so wrapping this deep dive up then, we've explored this Yang Taosha strategy, cultivate, ensnare, slaughter, and how China seems to use it in tech.
Right, looking at robotics, operating systems, AI, even developer platforms.
We chewed over whether Tesla got caught in that playbook, including maybe a soft slaughter through market forces and policy shifts.
Yeah, impacted significantly, but not eliminated.
And we've looked hard at Apple's supply chain shift, the real moves to India and Vietnam, the reasons behind it, but also the huge challenges and ongoing reliance on China.
It really paints a picture of these massive global shifts happening in tech and manufacturing, driven by strategy, economics, and geopolitics.
It does. So here's a final thought maybe for you to mull over. Considering how China has built up its tech prowess, often leveraging open source and adapting existing technologies, and the simultaneous pressure we see on foreign firms there, what are the long-term implications?
Good question. Is that Yang Taosha model, or variations of it, sustainable for China in the long run? And how will other countries, other companies react or adapt? Does it change how we think about global innovation and collaboration versus competition?
Yeah, lots to chew on there as this whole global landscape keeps evolving. This deep dive definitely gave us a lot to think about.
For sure.
And hey, speaking of interesting takes, if you enjoyed this kind of discussion, you might want to check out our buddy Micky's YouTube channel, Mickytolife. He often has some really fun and engaging content on similar topics.
Yeah, definitely worth a look. Good stuff over there.
Cool. Well, that's it for this deep dive.